But this is about a specific book called The Open Road, or Open Road, rather. And we have artist Justine Kurland, the editor and the organizer of this whole project, Denise Wolff, and artist Alec Soth. So I'm going to let them take it away because they have much more interesting things to say than me. And thank you all for coming.
Thanks for coming. Like she said, I'm Denise Wolff from Aperture. I'm an editor there, and I commissioned this project. And today I'm going to give you just a really short overview of the book and then turn it over to the stars. And Alec is going to talk about his work, and Justine is going to talk about her work in the book and in general. And then we're going to go into some sparkling conversation and some questions from you all. So, yeah. That's it. Let's begin. Oh, that's the book. The Open Road, Photography in the American Road Trip. And the book opens with this great quote by Walt Whitman. I inhale great draughts of space. The east and the west are mine. The north and the south are mine. I am larger, better than I thought. I did not know I held so much goodness. All seems beautiful to me. And what's so neat about this quote is that even before cars were on the road, Walt Whitman wrote this. And it's this idea and the dream, the fantasy of this open road, this great travel. And not only is the landscape open, this kind of idea, but also the mind is open. You become larger than yourself. You become part of the land, and hopefully your eyes are open. And it's a really great poem, the Song of the Open Road. So he coined that term. And then here's just like some great maps that are in the book, this fantasy of the open road that is really central to American culture and also central to photography. So the book kind of goes from this idea that we have this just infinite road, this kind of ongoing now that is really part of the American psyche, I would argue, and also part of photography. And almost everyone has shot, this one happens to be by Robert Frank, but almost everyone has shot one of these, and anyone can shoot it. But this is, I think, how we imagine it. So the book goes from this kind of infinity and ongoing now and ends up here with Tayo Honorado and Nico Krebs, where they took their own toy road and kind of made fun of that trope of the road. It also kind of starts, we have this fantasy of the road, but there's also the reality. And this is some of the first cars on the road, and they just kind of get stuck in the mud. So there are a lot of challenges. And photography first starts becoming part of the road with these photo auto guides. And before there were the Great American Roadside Maps, they didn't have maps of the roads. They were so new that they took photos of how to get to someplace. Like, turn left here, and it showed the car. You can see the car turning left and right and arrows. And I think this was from like New York City to Albany, and there were several of these routes. But they became really quickly obsolete because things changed. And as soon as they changed, the photos were not useful anymore. So it kind of goes from this technology, which is really early, kind of pre-Google Street View, and then the book kind of ends with Doug Rickard, which is work that he made about doing an American road trip without even leaving his living room. So he made this using Google Street View, so this kind of very early involvement of photography to up to the minute. Also, just photography became part of this dream of the road trip early on through advertising. It was the leisure activity you did on the road. And this is one from around, I think, 1907, which is around the same time as those photo auto guides and really where infrastructure was starting to be built. So as soon as the roads started rising, photography was part of it. And here you can see the lady driver. She's holding a camera. She's very fancy. Note the open air car. These fantasies we have are also kind of enforced by advertising. This was a fantastic toy just to show you how ingrained photography is to the road. This was a toy. It came out, I think, in around the 40s. But the lady passenger, the car moves around. It makes a mysterious sound that is very annoying. And when it stops, the lady puts the camera up and she takes a picture. And so, even in children's toys, and this is made in China, it's called photoing on car. So this idea of photoing and driving was always part of the culture. Just to go along with the open-air car, there is just a fantastic array of cars in this, and so I'm just going on a little sidetrack here. But this is Walker Evans, and again, you see the kind of the lady passenger and the open-air car. This was super popular for a while, and this is just such a gorgeous, gorgeous picture. Here we are again. This is a Studebaker. This is actually Walker Evans' Studebaker, and that's Robert Frank at the wheel. Maybe you didn't know, but occasionally Robert Frank would travel with Walker Evans, and this was an assignment for Fortune. He snapped this photo, and I think in the essay, David Campany, the author, makes the point that we expect those buildings to still be there, but that Studebaker is gone. So this idea of consumerism in the car as something that isn't going to last forever is also part of it. Just further, these kind of Studebakers and Chevys, kind of 57 Chevys were really the thing. This is by Inga Marath from Road to Reno. And here we're continuing on. This is 1964. This is Gary Winogrand. But that car still features beautifully in the open doors, open landscape. Again, more of that car. And then we kind of shift into Fords for a while in these kind of 70s look. This is William Eggleston. Joel Marowitz. We were definitely in the 70s cars. Car in a bubble. There's a lot of cars. This is Stephen Shore's car. That's the car he drove. You might not know, but Stephen Shore, Robert Frank, and Joel Sternfeldt, they didn't own cars when they started this work. Some of them rented cars, and then ultimately they bought cars. But Stephen actually learned to drive during American surfaces. So he didn't know how to drive at all. But he drove this green car, and it's in a lot of the pictures. The van starts to feature from Sternfeldt to now. The van is king. And so you got the VW van. This is actually a Stephen Shore. I don't think he rented that van, but it's in the picture. This picture, a very famous picture by Sternfeldt, and also you can see, this is his VW van. There's also another picture in the book where his van is like in the background. So, and then this is Ryan McGinley. And I love this because the city kids are traveling with him and they're afraid of the nature and they're just up on the van, which is in stark contrast to Justine's van. I think both of you guys drive vans, don't you? See, the van is king. Where I think this van shows a kind of vulnerability. It's just open to everything and you can see everything inside. So very different from that McGinley van. Anyways, this is a kind of tour of the cars. Which is a little side note that has fascinated me, like how the car is depicted. But just to give you a little bit of a book overview, this is the content. So the book has a very long kind of essay about the history of the road trip from those kind of photo auto guides to Doug Rickard. And then it's divided into almost chapters, really looking at some work in depth. And I think that's because I didn't want to just do a drive-by and have this be a who's who, and you kind of see one image by this person and one by that person. I really wanted you to see how so much great work was made on the American roads and start to get a sense of how the bodies of work talk to each other and get a sense of those bodies of work in more depth. So it starts with this long history, or the short history of the long road, and it's just the essay. This right here on the left is, or my left, is Edward Weston, and when they wanted to illustrate Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, they commissioned Weston to go on a road trip. And I thought, well, how appropriate that road trip was going to illustrate this text that was made, coined the term the open road. This is Cartier-Bresson's 1947 trip, and this is how it appears in The Decisive Moment. And actually, he'd made a book maquette of just the American work with Alexei Brodovich, and that maquette was lost. It's probably somewhere in Condé Nast's archive, but no one's ever found it. And one day it's going to surface and be the most amazing thing ever. but it's lost. One of the great surprises among many was learning that Bernice Abbott had done a long series of road trips exploring Route 1 from Maine to Florida, and that she shot a lot of it in color, and this is a Bernice Abbott. This is a Rauschenberg, so this idea of a kind of ongoing tire track and ongoing now is very prevalent. So that's a little bit about the essays. These are some of the chapters, and I just thought I would show just a few to give some context to what Alec and Justine are going to show and how they fit in the conversation. But of course, Robert Frank, really, that the chapters start with him and everything kind of pulsates in and around that, because I think he's the first person where you really, the kind of artist road trip became a thing. It became a kind of solid, recognized genre with Frank, and it was such complete work, motifs over and over again, and really made to be a book. And it's so complete and so amazing and so subjective that it's hard to actually make work after that. And I think part of the question of the book is how do people make work after Robert Frank? And they do it in a lot of different ways. I'm going super quick. I think Gary Winogrand, 1964, is so important because you start to get a sense of motion that didn't show up as prevalently before, like this kind of palpable and visible sense that he is moving and on to the next thing, and that's how he shot, and that the road trip is perfect for him. And I think people react against that later, and one of those people is Stephen Shore. So you start seeing large format come into the conversation, and everything becomes still in a way. And I think Stephen really starts to solidify this idea that America is itself art, and his work is so both literal and symbolic at the same time. And I think that some of that gets picked up later. Another person who looms very large in my mind is Joel Sternfeldt, and I kind of see you guys working against him and in conversation with his work in some ways. And I think there's something, the way he uses irony, and also there's a kind of disquiet, but also a disarmingness to the work, and scale and things happening here. But it's a really affectionate and surreal portrait of America. And I think going in, if you'd asked me my favorite, I'd have said Shore. Shore's the heart, and in some ways he is. He's the conceptual heart. But I think I walked away really having American Prospects really resonate with me, and seeing it over and over and over again as a kind of center in some ways that led to other things. And just to show you where it goes, kind of after Alec and Justine, the book ends with Tayo Honorado and Nico Krebs, another kind of Swiss duo, and somebody had to kind of make fun of it. That was almost all that's left to do. And if you look closely, if you look at these side by side, you can come to this and think, oh, it's a Joel Sternfeldt. So they almost don't make sense without Joel, but when you start looking at it, they're hilarious. But it's, again, there's an affection for America that appears in here, and I love the way they make the road out of their bed covers, and it also is playing on Stephen Shore American surfaces with the wood paneling. And then they've put the French fries. I don't know if you can see it, but there's this like kind of, almost postcard look at the Grand Canyon, but they've put French fries in it. And so they're playing on these tropes of the road and what's come before it. And it's a great art project. I thought I would end just by showing Justine and Alec's maps. At the end of the book, we mapped everyone's project as much as we could. And I think it's really interesting to look at them and think about how people traveled and the routes they took. And it's deceptive to look sometimes because this, especially Alec, looks like one trip, but that's several years in trips. And Justine, I think we were surprised putting yours together at all the places you went. I don't even think you realized until we mapped it. So there's something very different in the modes of travel, and I think that shows up in the work too. So it's been a really exciting project to work on something so near and dear to the history of photography, and it's one of those ideas that kind of seemed like it needed to be a book. And it's also interesting to look at how these bodies of work talk to each other, and we think we know them. Uncommon Places or American Prospects are almost code. They're almost a meme. We don't have to take that book off the shelf. But actually, when you look at them together and really read what's going on, there's a lot to see. So I hope you will pick up the book. We're also, just to tell you, we're doing a signing right after this at the Aperture booth at 8:12. So come on down. So I'm going to turn it over to Alec.
Great. Thank you. Looking at this map, it's deceptive because it is this straight line, but which follows the Mississippi River. But in fact, it doesn't directly follow the river, and it's not such a straight line. If you got in there, if you zoomed in really closely, a big part of the spirit of road trip photography is being able. I actually remember on my first big Mississippi River trip, because I live in Minneapolis, and driving to the river and realizing, well, I could go right, or I could go left, or I could go on this side of the river, on the Minnesota side or the Wisconsin side, and sort of all the different possibilities in that, and being open to serendipity. And along those lines, for this talk, I wanted to be open to whatever was on my mind today. And so what's on my mind today primarily is the movie Boyhood, which I saw last night. Yeah. And it's so this morning I was frantically changing everything about this talk. For those that haven't seen the movie, I mean, it's about a boy growing up. But the spirit of boyhood is such a part of my working process, and I'm sure this will be a theme in the conversation today. But and also thinking about time. So I went to this movie with my wife, who's right over there in that round chair, and today is our 18th anniversary. Thank you. And before that Mississippi River trip, Rachel and I made a Mississippi River trip when I was 22. It was during spring break in college, and we traveled from Minneapolis to Memphis. And I didn't know what I was doing. I was just taking pictures, but seeing that movie Boyhood, he's a photographer in the movie, and that first feeling when you're first starting to see the world around you and everything's open up is so much really what it's still about. And it was interesting, Denise, when you said you can't do anything else. That it's over, but which I understand that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like something to contend with.
Yes, right. Well, we can talk more about that. But there's this. Sometimes I get really jaded about road trip photography, and I feel, oh, God, it's so obvious, such a cliche. But then I'll encounter someone who's 17 and they're like so excited about the darkroom, so excited about looking at the world. And fundamentally, that's really what it is about. So just a couple more pictures. Rachel and I made this trip in the springtime, and so things were cold in the north and blossoming as we went south. That was something that I repeated when I did Sleeping by the Mississippi. That was our dog, Tasha. We visited Rachel's grandmother in Missouri on that trip. Our van, right? Yeah.
You still drive that van?
No, that's a long time ago. Yeah. No, we've been minivans since. Minivans. So now I want to talk about another movie. This has also been on my mind. In the current issue of Aperture magazine, I was asked to list 10 favorite things, and one of my favorite things is this movie, Kings of the Road by Wim Wenders. I actually saw this movie probably when I was 18 or so, and it was a life changer. It's about two guys on a driving around Germany. One's a cinema repairman, and the other is a depressed middle-aged man. And it's, like Boyhood, it's a really long movie, really slowly paced, and you're just kind of watching life go by. I just encountered, sorry to give you text, but I just encountered this like 3 days ago when Wim Wenders's talk, where he said, I followed the method of daydreaming. Story always assumes control. It knows its course. It knows what matters. It knows where it begins and ends. Daydream is quite different. What it has is a kind of subconscious guide who wants to get on, no matter where. Every dream is going somewhere, but who can say where that is? And that quality of like daydreaming, it was fundamental to what I wanted in Sleeping by the Mississippi. I wanted the logic to be like a dream logic. I kind of explain that. It's also related to this quote, which I used from the very beginning in sort of every grant application from Robert Frank. The project I have in mind is one that will shape itself as it proceeds and is essentially elastic. So it just sort of, it goes where it wants to go. This actually started before it was a Mississippi River trip. It was called From Here to There, and the idea was that one picture leads to the next. So here a boy with a chicken, and then an older boy with an egg. And this morning, this was amazing to me, all this boyhood stuff.
But Superman too.
Superman too. That was actually the next picture, was a Superman picture, but skipping way ahead. I'm not going to show a lot of Sleeping by the Mississippi, but I just want to reference how that logic is connected. So this is a picture of Charles Lindbergh's boyhood bed, and to me that was a really it was an evocative place to be in, because this imagining this boy sleeping on this porch overlooking the Mississippi River. And in that From Here to There process, looking for one picture leading to the next, I read some biography of Lindbergh. He talked about he and his father had planned on going on a Mississippi River trip, and it just seemed so full of potential. And of course, he had this incredible life ahead of him. But so that picture, for me, is very much connected to this picture. This guy's name happens to be Charles. I love those little connections beneath the surface, but flight and also, I mean, this is very much a boy picture. It's like a grown up wanting to be a boy, wanting to dream, wanting to wander. To go back to Kings of the Road for a second, that movie is interesting because it's actually, it's not the individual road trip. And it's kind of funny, this panel discussion sort of it's going to, I think, have this element of what does it mean to make a road trip with another person. And I loved that movie. I loved the relationship of these two men in the movie. And it's something I've been thinking a lot about, because for the last few years I've been traveling with a writer, Brad Zeller, and it's really uncanny, because after I met Brad, I learned that Kings of the Road was one of his favorite movies as well, and it's absolutely fascinating to me because it's a pretty obscure movie, and we've been driving around producing these things called the Dispatch, the LBM Dispatch. We just finished our 7th one, and traveling the country and looking at all different sorts of elements, of American culture and so on and so forth. But beneath the surface, there is this boy thing that's happening, and also something about brotherhood. On our first trip, we went to a moose lodge in Ohio, and we spent the whole day there. Brad actually became a moose that day.
You resisted?
Well, I resisted, and I mean, he holds it against me. But but the work fundamentally, when we started, was about community and what it means to be connected, and also this issue of brotherhood. And so this is just a spread from the Ohio Dispatch. This is an essay telling the story of becoming a moose. Here are some of his moose brothers. And it was interesting, I pulled a few slides up this morning from different trips. But so this is in Ohio. This is in Texas.
Are those mooses?
They're not mice. No. But this repeating motif, so this stuff beneath the surface. And then finally, in our most recent trip to Georgia, this is at a camp for the blind. And what's great about road trip photography for me, too, is that, and this is very much in the spirit of Robert Frank, is that you have this one level of social observation, and then you have this other level about internal stuff. I mean, The Americans is very much about Robert Frank, and this work has become somewhat about brotherhood and about what that means. I believe that is the end of my little talk.
All right. And now we're going to go to the women's road trip. I mean, in some ways, it is a little bit of a boys' club. And even in movies, it does talk a little bit about this in the book. The women's road trip is Psycho, Thelma and Louise. Like, generally, women in literature and film are portrayed, especially traveling American women, are portrayed as, like, running into trouble or completely psychotic. But I think Justine is a nice foil to that. It's like, decidedly not Psycho. So. But there's also an element to boyhood to this. So
there's my little boy.
That's maybe not the best introduction, but
no.
Here you go.
I'm actually going to read something, which I feel like is a little bit cheating after that wonderful last minute. Anyway, what Alex just. But what I'm reading is something that I wrote 3 years ago at a time when my son was 6. The essay is called "Now We Are 6." Right. So I've put a bunch of photographs from different projects together in this essay that I wrote 3 years ago, which was a moment at which I went from going on these road trips for 8 months of the year, traveling around with my son the whole time, to going on road trips for 3 months of the year, or actually 4 months of the year, because I started teaching and I put my son in school. So, but the end of this is actually the newer work that I make now during my summer vacation and teaching, the 3 months I have off that and the month I have off in the winter. So it's not chronological. Anyway, I'll just start and we'll see how it goes. I took Casper on his first road trip when he was 3 months old. And by the time he was 1, we managed to stay away for the better part of each year. For the next 6 years of his life. We drove across the country many times and slept nestled under down comforters in the back of a van, with all of our worldly possessions packed around us. We would climb rocks in the desert and trees in the forest, building forts from sticks and making soup with pine needles. If our car was to hit a sudden bump, an assortment of glass jars might spill insect specimens out on the floor, so that the next day we would wake up with ladybugs in our hair. On the one hand, it was the most beautiful way to be together, but it was also the most brutal way to try to be a mother trapped alone together for months on end while I was always struggling with him to let me make work. His being penetrated every part of my consciousness and my working process. It changed what I photographed and how I photographed. Nothing could be overthought or seen directly, but happened peripherally to my parenting. The work became less directed and more prayed for, each picture a kind of miracle, a ghost gleaned from somewhere out there in the American landscape. And I was forever being pulled back by Casper. I remember yelling at him once in total frustration, "Jeff Wall doesn't have to make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in the middle of his photo shoots." And he replying at 4, "Oh yeah? What else does Jeff Wall not have to do?" Casper grew up on the road, believed it was normal, believed other mamas were loading sheet film in McDonald's, believed other kids lived in vans, and played with rocks as their parents composed scenes. Once he woke up sweetly from a nap in his car seat and said, "Where are we, Mama? Are we shopping for views?" People often thought we were homeless, sometimes offering food or money. Oops, that was for that slide. That's the, I pressed it, it didn't work. Our migration took a southern route in the winter and a northern route in the summer. And while my wanderlust was insatiable, Casper's tendency was towards routine and predictability. To accommodate this, I created a bubble around our life in the van. I set up a play tent and sawed the legs off of a card table and arranged his toys the same at each new campsite, where I spent hours stuck, playing with trains first and Legos later. Often the moments I photographed him were not the loving moments of a mother gazing at her child, but of a prisoner glaring at her guard. Casper, feeling the intensity of everything I needed out of a photograph, not to mention the particularly arduous task of standing still for a large format camera, shied from it. And so I learned to bribe and extort photographs from him. His favorite pose was to place his hand in front of his face, but he later learned more subtle forms of protest, contorting his body inward as I bore down on him with a scolding lens. He also eventually rejected the nature boy role I cast for him, preferring the signage along the road, which was where he learned to read. And cars, he drew and memorized car logos. And the strip malls that have homogenized the American roadside, Denny's and Walmart's, being a special treat from the forests where we camped. At a primitive skills gathering, he wanted to bring a glow stick to a campfire. And I explained to him that no one would appreciate it because it was made of plastic and filled with chemicals, and because they were trying to do things the natural way. And he, at 5, said, "But they have tents and cars, Mama." In time, Casper grew more restless while I photographed. No longer interested in the games I brought him or my half attention. Once, while I was waiting for a train to photograph, Casper broke away from me, running into the industrial wilderness besides the tracks, yelling out, "I don't need you, I don't need anybody." Although my decision to get off the road was made for many reasons, I recognized that wrapping Casper up into my world was becoming unbearable for him. Where he had once basked in the pleasure of being with his mama, now he seemed to have grown out of the van. We had reached that bittersweet moment where, still clinging to me, he demanded his independence. So this past road trip was our last together. Driving down some bit of highway, I remember wondering, as I often do, if it was worth it, torturing Casper, his dad, and myself in order to make work. Thinking out loud, I said, "I don't know why I do it. I don't know why I'm a photographer." And Casper, at 6, responded, "Mama, you're a photographer so you can go on road trips." As if to say, "I forgive you." Yeah. But so those pictures are like, the essay was taken around the photographs that I was following these trains and train riders and photographing Casper at our campsites all at the same time. So there were kind of 3 different modes of photography that were intersecting to talk something larger about the American landscape and American mythology at the same time, looking at the actual thing in itself. But I put together a larger, like those last pictures are pictures that I did actually continue to bring him on road trips, so this was kind of a lie. But but only like 2 months of the year when he had his summer vacation, and not the normal. Yeah.
They're your rules. You can break them.
Yeah.
Well, maybe a good place to start is this idea of the companion who travels with you, because I think a lot of people think of Robert Frank as they think of the lone artist traveling alone, and that actually isn't true. A lot of the work in here is made with people in the car and different trips, and can be quite friendly. And in some ways, maybe the companions are helping you make the decisions of where you're going and what you're shooting. So maybe you could each talk about who you're traveling with and how they're impacting your trip and the work you make.
Sure. I mean, in my case, a lot of it's about the fantasy of solitude. I did a different project called Broken Manual that was all over America, looking at these men attempting to run away from their lives. But they're not really running away from they're not off the grid. They're pretty easy to find, sometimes on the internet or what have you. In the same way, for half the time I was traveling, I had a film crew with me, in part because I wanted companionship, and that's very much true of this recent work that I've been doing with this writer. Is that I was kind of tired of the solitude, but at the same time, the work in the end evokes that solitary experience. So it's a fantasy that I'm playing off of and playing with, just like, the old country songs about, lonesome, expanses and whatever. But you can't live alone, really. You can't. Yeah.
And Justine, your companion is present, so we can talk a little bit about that.
Well, I was just thinking, Alec, about Neil Cassidy and Jack Kerouac, and the way in which, when you're talking about, some of the slides that you had about King of the Road, the idea of following the daydream is like, it's like there's a daydream inside of the daydream, so that other person that's with you kind of represents a certain kind of wildness. Like, it was interesting to see the two of you on the bed together, where you kind of look like a little bit tighter, like you're not the one that's going to become the moose, but obviously Brad Ziller has a kind of a freedom about him that is like is a way of like it's like when you have a dream, you're not there's the object of desire, I'm not talking about that in a sexual way, but there's like, it's a kind of an interesting thing of the thing that you follow, or the kind of the way that there has to be this kind of alter ego or a character that then does get to break through to some other level. And so,
Is Casper that?
So yeah. No, I mean, clearly a child has a different kind of surprise and amazingness at the world. And there was a point with my work that it really shifted from photographs where I was staging narratives, where I was kind of putting stories into the world and photographing them in this film still type of a way, to being with Casper, where there were some just practical reasons why you let go of the higher production if you have a kid, because you can't. I couldn't manage to wrangle people to do what I wanted them to do at that point. Your hands are just like really full, but in a way I didn't need that anymore, because then I'm watching his interaction with the landscape in America and in the road. So he becomes that surrogate. But the train pictures were all because he loved trains. He was obsessed with them, almost to this kind of Asperger level of needing to know everything about them. Like, where I remember he would hold up a train when he was like 3 and ask me and like point to the wheels and be like, "What's that, Mama?" And I'd be like, "Honey, that's the wheel." He's like, "Not the wheel. What's that?" And he'd like point, and I had to find out that bar that connects the wheels is called a coupling rod. Like things like, and he had to know about like the signage along the track and all of these kinds of things that made my understanding of it, I would go deeper because I'd be following his interest in something. And then in a way, you're kind of free to be to wander because you're like, like if you're chasing a butterfly or something and you get lost, or, it's that kind of a thing of like a drift that can happen.
I like that you talked a little bit about serendipity, and it seems like there's a sense of that in the way your writing with Casper also has this sense of serendipity, where the day is going to go, and Mom, where am I? And I wondered if you could talk about how that features into these trips, which in some ways look slightly planned, but then you couldn't possibly plan where these pictures are coming from. So maybe could you talk a little bit about that?
I mean, I really feel like accident is the lifeblood of photography. And I think when I was a younger photographer, I was much more controlling about how I was going to make a photograph, because it takes a certain amount of faith to like allow for accidents to happen. Yeah, I mean, even when I was making stage narrative photographs, I feel like what distinguished me maybe from other practitioners of that was that I allowed the narrative to unravel, and the surprise of what the world has to offer. Like that, I would think that the picture would be about one thing, but then I would look at my film and realize that it was about something else completely. So there's this kind of like there's that type of accident. But then I think when Alec was talking about the kind of the wandering that he does, I think that's like a different, similar, but I think that there's a kind of, I'm just thinking about this whole other idea now with that, because I think that the word, like I use the word migration in my, this thing, and I think there's a difference between a migration and the idea of exploration. And I've been going on these road trips for like 15 years now, and I have a kind of a migratory pattern that I make, which I feel like, I don't know, and then inside of that you're kind of exploring, but I think when Alec was talking about zooming in, and you have to have the plan so you can break it, so I guess there's that.
Is there something about, I guess part of the serendipity question is there something about traveling by car that is part of this too? So
yeah, because you can't you can go off route.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the planning is essential too. So from the beginning, from Sleeping by the Mississippi onward, I would do lots of research, which is really aided, obviously by the internet and by sort of MapQuest and then Google Maps and all the, so you can like create these routes with these sort of planned events or what have you. But what's really amazing about this dispatch project, for example, because the conceit is that we're reporters, that we're working for a newspaper, so we plan to attend different events. But since we don't work for a real newspaper, on our way to one, if we see something else, we follow it. And just having the nose for that is what it's all about. And I'm in the same place where it's sort of over time, it's this relaxing into accidents and kind of knowing and trusting that it's going to come. Sometimes it doesn't come for days, and then you're like, oh, it gets scary. But I think it's similar to jazz music, which probably has a similar sort of tradition in terms of time, but of creating a structure and then just allowing for these improvisatory moments, I guess.
I'm kind of just curious as a footnote what you're both listening to, because I have a mental soundtrack to what I think you might be listening to, but I don't know. Wait, what are the main stuff? Are you radio? Or?
No, so yeah, that comes up a lot. And
Johnny Cash?
Yeah, no, it comes up. And what's really interesting is that with all this work I've done with Brad has this iPod with 30,000 songs. He's like a super music aficionado, and he curates like a soundtrack for the whole trip, and I've never been that person. So I'll listen to like sports talk radio, or something. It doesn't.
Did not expect that.
It's really surprising. So I mean, early on, I used to like get in the mood, whatever.
What put you in the mood?
Yeah, in that sort of cliche
road mood.
Yeah, that road, but it's really much less of that now. Yeah.
Do you listen to music?
Well, I also have like a really embarrassing.
I have Tom Waits in my mind for you.
Oh, really? I love Tom Waits. I think that when I was younger and I went on road trips, there was this kind of idea of imagining myself in my own movie. So the idea of the wind in my hair and the windows rolled down, and I'd play the music really loud, and there was like even times where I'd like get out of my car and like dance at like some rest area, because it was like I finally got to California, and there's this there was these moments of total exhilaration, but sadly, they kind of like after I been on this trip, like I still feel happy, but I don't get out of my car and dance, and I don't listen to the same. I mean, I feel like that was like the 90s. But when then it was like Rafi. I listened to Rafi with Casper. You know what I mean? And and then after that, I feel like I listened to like a lot of book on tape, like kind of just because it's a long time in the car. It's like really. So yeah, that's a really unsexy answer.
Well, I wanted to know. I think in the book, a lot of people talk about a shift in perception in driving. Between driving and, say, walking or flying to a place and how you approach a place. And I wondered if you guys could talk about the role of driving in the work and how it impacts your perception or the road trip. Is it a kind of heightened perception? Is it filled with boredom, or, what does it mean, this movement by car?
Well,
go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really important distinction. How you navigate a space is how you understand where you are and what it is. So, I mean, I started making this work when I was in graduate school, and I grew up in the city. I was in New York City, so I never knew how to drive, and all of a sudden having the car was this access to the windshield and to landscape, that it was like all framed inside of this landscape. Like, that was an amazing way to see it going by. But I mean, I also feel that on one hand there's the understanding of how the landscape changes and like a certain kind of like temporal pacing that happens because as you drive across country. But there's also the thing of like being, it empties you out. You get so bored. That there is a kind of sensitivity that you have that if the light shifts like just ever so slightly, it becomes like so exciting. So you get tuned because nothing else is going on. Like I can't make work in New York City where I live because I'm constantly bombarded visually with so much stimulus that it doesn't have the same. But
for me, the car is such. It's like. It's so analogous to the camera in some ways, like this glass, the world out there, the glass, and then you on this side. And you're like, you're in the world, but you're a little bit separated from it. And so that's why the two they work together really well. And there is a whole tradition, obviously, of like walking photography, and I've never been able to do that.
Yeah, 8x10.
Yeah, no, there's that, but it's also like I'm just as happy, 10 steps away from the car as I am, hiking.
You guys both really like to drive, is that right?
I do, yeah, I do. Although, it's I'm getting sore as I get older. Yes.
I guess it would be remiss if we didn't talk about this is an American phenomena, and it's almost like America is more than a setting. It's not quite a character. It's a kind of tangential subject, and I think you're both getting at it in really different ways. But I wonder if there's something. Are you setting out to say something about America, or is that just happening, or what does it mean to you in the photographs? sorry.
That's a big one.
No, that's a big one, yeah. I mean, I think, well, first I could say that, like, I don't feel like I have permission to photograph anywhere else besides America, because I feel like it's something that I know and that I can have both, I have a great love for, but a critical distance to America. But, you know, just because we're talking about the road trip, I'm not thinking about any one specific project. I'm thinking now about, like, kind of the span of these 15 years of photographing on the road, where I feel like there's a certain draw in my work that was first and foremost about a cultural identity, about the West, and a kind of a sense that we have of Americans of being, you know, colonists, that we're going to, like, go out and this frontier spirit and conquer this land as we go. So as the work progresses, as I'm making these pictures, though, the work has become more and more, like I'm talking about being on the road with my kid, and it becomes more and more about this kind of subjective search that I have for my own sense of place and home and belonging. Yeah, so I mean, so I think I move away from a kind of generalized idea about what it is to be American to kind of more specific about, like, what my experience is about. But in both of those cases, I feel like, well, especially now that I'm photographing more of the kind of vernacular architecture along the road and these mechanics, that there's a kind of a way of like, how's it going out there? Like, what's up? Like, what's going on is kind of like peripheral to it. So it's kind of like, you know, I mean, I'm not comparing myself to Flaubert, but the idea, like, of sentimental education, where we follow Frederick's love story and we see the French Revolution on the sides of that, I feel like the politics of my work happen kind of peripheral to a certain kind of anyway.
In my case, I mean, it's this constant battle with that topic, and I just feel like it's a spectrum, and I keep going from one side to another, and again, you know, since Robert Frank is at the base of all this stuff, it's something that I think exists with him, where it's like, you know, with the Americans, it appears to be more about America, and then he gets way more interior with later work. But sometimes pushes out again. And in my case, lately I've been really pushing out into America again as a subject matter, less about myself, and it's endlessly rich too. It's and that's where I was sort of giving you a hard time about being jaded earlier, but because I think there's still so much. There's so many stories, so much interesting things happening. I mean, it's a big country, so there's a lot going on.
Is part of the draw for both of you and the road that it's always something kind of new? You can kind of, each place you go, it's kind of fresh? Or you don't know where you're
I think it was that originally. It is different now. I mean, it's because I've been too many places, and so it's harder to have that, oh, everything's new kind of moment. So it's, yeah.
I think it's more than that everything's new. It's that everything is better somewhere else, though. I don't know if you have that, but that kind of idea. Like, I tend to ping pong around. Like, when I go south, I'm like, shit, why did I go south? I really, like, should have gone north. So there's a kind of, like, second guessing that happens, and that becomes part of the motivation of, like, continuing to go to the next place and the next place. How do you decide with the dispatch work which locations?
That's really been serendipitous as well, kind of depending on, I mean, the first time I was giving a lecture in Ohio, and we thought, oh, let's go to Ohio. And then in other cases, we raised money through certain organizations that would give it to us, so then it became that place. And so,
I think it is interesting, this kind of regionalism, you know, covering America, but it's still, there's a sense of place there that is unique. Where some other people in the book, the kind of America could be anywhere in the pictures. You're not sure. I feel like.
And what is so interesting is that there is still so much variety, and you know, like Walker Evans. If you did a map of, you know, American photographs, it's like all east and south. He didn't go west at all. And yeah, what does it mean to say America? And really, you know, I mean, we're in Chicago. I mean, how different is Chicago from, you know, Atlanta or something? It's like incredibly different places. Still, when we think everything's homogenized, it's still so much variety.
One question I know David, I think, asked both of you when he was working on the book, but where does America start for you? Is it in your hometown? Is it off the freeways? Like how far away do you have to get from New York City, say, before America begins?
I remember him asking me that question and being like stumped then, as I am now. But I mean, I think for me, it's this idea that when you think of like America and not my home, when you think of it as you need a kind of a critical distance to do that. So you for me, I have to be away to do that. I have to not be in some place that is familiar. That's like so it usually takes 8 hours.
8 hours. It's different for you, Alec, though, because you're closer to home in some ways. Or...
Yeah, though I actually make very few pictures at home. And it's one of my great struggles I keep trying to work on. And, you know, watching Boyhood last night and thinking about how many of his films have been made in Texas. So it's something I would like to get over someday.
Yeah.
The 8-hour problem.
Yeah.
So you have the 8-hour,
Oh, yeah.
America is 8 hours away for you.
Yeah, that's about right, yeah.
Well, maybe we should take a few questions. Does anyone? Yeah?
So when you talk about Robert
So the question is, there's a number of people in the book, Robert Frank included, who are not from America, but looking at America not through American eyes, so he's Swiss. Is there something different about being an American and traveling the American road?
I think there is. It's hard to define it. I mean, I just did this short trip for the Aperture's benefit, which is coming up with Billy Bragg
On the 21st
on the
of October.
And so,
New York.
so you know, traveling, with a British guy and seeing his take on America is really fascinating. I think it's totally valid, and I think it's valid. Like if I go to Tokyo or something and do a project, I think it's valid. The outsider perspective. It's you just bring. You know, everyone brings different things to it. So.
Do you have anything to say to that or no?
Yeah, I mean, I think Alec. Well, it's kind of an interesting thing because it's like there's this other part too. Like I was just thinking about the last question that Denise asked. Like there's a kind of a way where I feel like I love America. I feel really nationalistic, and I'm. But at the same time, I feel like I'm not American at all. Like there's some kind of weird way that like, I don't know why I kind of feel like an outsider. Like I was a nerd in high school. Like people like threw snowballs at me when I was walking home from school. You know what I mean? There's something about like the role of whatever happened in my life that I've never. So there's still like I feel like I maintain a sense of outsiderness, and that's probably like a pathology that is not that healthy or helpful. But there is that too.
Are the photographs the cure?
Oh, that's no. They're just the pleasure of like of my symptoms.
Or the illness.
Of my illness, yeah. Oh.
So I was just saying that I don't see it as a negative pathological thing. I think you're an outsider in a way because you're an artist, and that's what allows you to see
That's an interesting point because it kind of brings up, and I think this was maybe also at the heart of that last question, is the kind of idea of, what right we have to make photographs. And so I think of as do you have to belong to a community to photograph that community? Like now we live in a time where Nigerians photograph Nigeria, and whatever community you're going to be photographing, like whether junkies photograph junkies, like whatever that is. Yeah, I mean, I was going to go somewhere else with that, but now I just I lost that train of. But yeah, oh no, I know what I was going to say. It was really important. Oh my God. Okay. Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, which is kind of one of the first, and I think in a way is one of the models for the Dispatch series, where James Agee and Walker Evans go to a tenement farmers as this kind of intelligentsia artists coming to a very poor agrarian community. The beginning of that is this kind of amazing part where Agee starts by saying what right do we have being there? And then finally says, first he's like, what right do we have to be there? And then he turns it around and he's like, but who are you to be looking at these pictures? And then he finally answers it by saying, we're all human, and so we're all part of a community. So I don't know how helpful that idea of the outsider. So when I'm talking about having a sense of myself as an outsider, I'm not actually proud of that. That I was it was confessional. It's like saying I have a pimple right here.
I know. I was just disagreeing with you. But I just wanted to say the other thing that really struck me about what you talked about was about being a mother and a photographer. And you said something about the intense need you have for the photograph, and then your child feeling that and kind of reacting. And in a way, that's an outside thing too. For me as a photographer, I'm in the family, but then I want to be out of the family to make the pictures, and I want them to wait for me, and come back. And there's always that kind of push and pull.
Yeah, I remember. Well, maybe Alec is also a father of two. He has two, and actually, maybe you could talk about the interview.
I kept having these dreams last night that Gus was on the panel. That's Alec's son, who did a really fantastic interview with Alec about sleeping by the Mississippi, really.
Yeah, well, he interviewed me about traveling and the amount that I travel, and wow. I'm not sure. I mean, my relationship is very different in that it's this going, it's I leave the family and then I return to the family. And this again seems central to me to what photography is about, at least for me, is this, it's like being in it but being away from it over and over and over again. And I mean, because that's part of the road trip fantasy. Like, if you really were living the road trip fantasy, why would you need to take pictures of it? I mean, you're taking pictures because you're going to share it with other people, which is this desire for camaraderie and community and connection. It's not just being in the moment and serendipity and all of that stuff. There's this longing that's at the end of it. And it's this strange mix of, separation and longing to be connected back and forth.
I mean, I think the question is really about blood, sweat, and tears, which is, it's a good question. It turns out, in fact, that the pictures that end up being maybe more successful are not because I walked a million miles with like really heavy gear, but there's some kind of way in which, and I feel like Alec, maybe you identify with this, because I'm shoot 4x5, but Alec shoots 8x10, which is twice as heavy and big and arduous, but there's no reason to shoot medium. Actually, you're doing digital now, right? Anyway, whatever. Sleeping by the Mississippi is 8x10. There's no reason to use those kinds of cameras. There's no reason to make life as difficult as we make it for ourselves. But somehow if you do that, then it's like a way of grounding yourself, and it slows you down, and it makes you feel like something is happening. So while in fact it's completely unnecessary, and having a view camera is like shooting yourself in the foot. There's like, it makes your picture static, and you have to have a tripod, and you miss half of the great things that you see. Like it's a terrible camera, but because it's so hard to do it, it like somehow then you feel like, okay, then I can have this kind of light touch moment where, like one of the pictures I showed where it's just like an oil stain. It's okay for me to do that now because, well, I've been driving for a long time and I have this big camera, and I can like, and so because I put the work there, the photographs themselves are allowed to have a lighter touch. I mean, does that make sense? Does that?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Just without talking as much about the technology part of it, I think the beat generation element is interesting because, I think we're on different ends of the spectrum here because I'm this, like, straight-laced, and the fantasy of Kerouac and all of that is not at all my existence. I have a very normal life, and
He has a labradoodle.
I have 2 kids, a labradoodle. It's like and actually my daily practice is, I have regular studio hours. It's like very structured, and part of the road trip is this. It's playing in this fantasy of this other thing, but it's not really the reality. And so the technological aspect of the 8x10 or whatever kind of fits into this. The confinement of structure and the fantasy of something else, of something broader. Yeah. I think when I first started, I played more this character of that, which I'm embarrassed about now, and I'm trying to get rid of that. Like I'm not that person.
You're not joining the Mooses.
Well, the Moose, no. I'm probably closer to joining the Moose than I am to being Jack Kerouac.
Hi. I'm going to try to phrase this in a way that's like sensitive, but looking at your pictures,
Mine?
Yeah, okay. I can't help but question like how this has affected your son psychologically, and I'm not trying to point at anything, but your work is provoking that from me, and I am like very curious, like what this has done to him, what effect this has had on him.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because there was I don't even know the person's name, but it was like all over the internet. That kid who was like the guy who was photographing his kid like with her hands in her pants. Who do you know who I'm talking? Someone knows who I'm talking about. It was like, do you know what I'm talking about? Okay. Recent, yeah. It was like on internet. It was all over the place. In like we could talk about Sally Mann, or like any number of situations. So, I mean, if you want to, there's a couple of different. Like if we're talking about parenting, I think that there's the idea of normalcy and the idea of damage are two different things. Like I don't think that kids get any more or less damaged in like a normal environment where maybe their parents are abusive and don't give them love, or there's all sorts of kinds of ways. But well, let me finish. But what I'm talking about and what I really try to honestly talk about is a certain type of a way in which I'm both inspired by my kid, but then it's also there's a confrontation there. So like when I'm like, come on, let me photograph you, stand still, and he's like, no, and I'm like, I'll give you a cookie if you do it, and he's like, fine. That's like there's a kind of a way in which that way of getting my attention through photography is probably not the best way to get attention, but I feel like there's a kind of a way in which the act of photographing for me is an act of love also, and that the adventures that I brought him on, I was homeschooling him, and we spent so much time together, and I like little kids just really want their parents' attention. So I was able to do that for him, like instead of like where maybe normally if I had just like a straight job, I would be putting him in a daycare, and I was able to be there for him at a certain level. So I mean, it's hard to say. Like I really love my kid, and I do a pretty good job taking care of him. But he, I don't know. I mean. I think there's other stories too of parents who brought their kids on the roads. Like Lee Friedlander's kid is a cellist. He's an avant-garde jazz cellist now, and he made a composition that's all based on being on road trips with his dad. That's about like looking at the lights out the window, which is like probably super boring, but made an impression on him. Like if I was in like in China, like maybe my kid would like have to come to the rice field with me or the factory with me or whatever. There's a kind of a way in which the life that I made for Casper was a life that he was protected and safe, but it wasn't normal. So I don't know if that might have saved him from a certain kind of other I don't know.
Oh, sorry.
Oh.
I don't mean to cut you off, but we're being cut off. Is there any, let's take one more question. Is there anybody else who has a burning question? Okay. Well, just to repeat again, we only have a few advanced copies, like, 40 or 50 in the world here. And we're going to be doing a signing at the Aperture booth, which is 812. So you go to 8 and walk all the way down right after this. So thank you so much.